The night was cold, the kind of cold that made even the wooden walls of the old farmhouse groan in protest. The human farmer, James, had spent the day working in the fields, his boots heavy with dust, his muscles aching from endless labor. He had no idea that tonight, something, or someone, had already entered his home. The kitchen window stood slightly open, just enough for a shadow to slip through. And that shadow was not human. She moved carefully, almost weightlessly, her bare feet touching the creaky floorboards with the skill of someone used to hiding. The alien woman pressed her thin frame against the wall, her large eyes scanning the dark room. Hunger had driven her here, hunger so sharp it felt like knives twisting in her stomach. Her name was Sira. Once she had been a wife, proud and strong, but the war had stolen her partner, and with him the security of her life. Since then she wandered from place to place, taking what little she could find. Tonight she had not planned to enter a human's house, but the smell of bread had broken, her last wall of resistance. She reached the counter. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid of a pot, and steam brushed against her tired face. A half-finished soup sat inside, thick and rich, filled with vegetables. Her mouth watered instantly. For a moment she froze, wondering if this was a trap. But then her body reminded her it had been 3 days since she last ate. She dipped her fingers in the broth and tasted it. Warmth spread across her tongue, almost bringing tears to her eyes. Every movement she made was careful. She pulled a piece of bread from a basket, hiding it inside the folds of her tattered clothing. Then she crouched low, listening. Silence. The man of the house had not yet returned, or so she thought. But James was already walking up the dirt road, the lantern in his hand swinging with each step. He pushed the gate open and sighed, his thoughts heavy with loneliness. His wife had died years ago, and since then the house felt less like a home and more like an empty box filled with shadows. All he had left was routine: work, eat, sleep, repeat. Inside, Sira stiffened. She heard the faint crunch of boots outside. Her breath caught in her throat. Panic rushed through her body, but she forced herself to stay calm. Running now would make noise. Running now would get her caught. Instead, she slid deeper into the shadows of the kitchen, curling herself into the darkest corner she could find. The door opened. James entered, placing his lantern on the table. The small flame cast long, stretching shadows across the walls. He removed his coat, shook off the cold, and muttered to himself about the hard day. He did not yet notice the strange presence hidden in the room. Sira held her breath, every muscle tight. She watched him move, the way he stretched his back, the way he reached for a glass of water. To him, this was just another night. To her, this was survival. She pressed her hand against her stomach, praying he would eat quickly and go to bed so she could escape into the night with food in her hands. But James was not blind. He placed his glass on the table and looked around. Something felt wrong. The air carried an unfamiliar scent, something sharp, something not of earth. He noticed the bread basket, slightly shifted. He frowned. His farm was far from the town. No one should be here. The alien woman closed her eyes, as if squeezing them shut would make her invisible. She was ready to run, ready to throw herself out the window if needed. But her body was weak. Hunger had stolen her speed, her strength. If he caught her, she knew she would not be able to fight back. James picked up the lantern again and slowly scanned the room. His eyes moved across the shelves, the counter, the floor. Then, just for a moment, the light caught her face. Wide, terrified eyes reflected back at him. He froze. His heart thudded in his chest. He had heard of alien refugees broken by war wandering through the outer settlements, but he never expected one in his own home. For a second, neither of them moved. Time itself seemed to stop, stretching thin, waiting for the first action. Sira's breathing grew heavier. She thought of her husband, of the nights they used to laugh together before war ripped everything apart. Shame burned inside her. She was no longer the woman she once was. She was a thief, caught stealing scraps. James slowly lowered the lantern, his face unreadable. Was he angry? Was he afraid? She could not tell. She prepared to dash for the window, her legs shaking, her heart pounding. But before she could move, the floor creaked beneath James' boots as he stepped closer. The silence was unbearable, the distance between them shrinking with every second. The air carried tension so sharp it felt like the edge of a blade. Then his voice broke the silence, low and steady. "I know you're there," he said, his tone neither harsh nor soft. "And I know you're hungry." Sierra's eyes widened. She had expected shouting, threats, maybe even violence, but this man's words carried something different. Curiosity, calm, even kindness. And so the night began with two souls standing in a kitchen, one human, one alien, both broken in different ways, as the fire of suspense burned brighter than either of them could have imagined. James stood frozen in his own kitchen, his lantern light shaking slightly as it revealed the fragile figure pressed against the wall. The alien woman did not blink, did not breathe too loudly, as though stillness itself could protect her. The house was silent, but inside both hearts, human and alien, the storm of fear and uncertainty raged. Sierra's body was weak, yet her instincts sharpened. Every muscle in her frame screamed at her to run, to throw herself through the window and vanish into the night. But her legs betrayed her. Hunger had drained her strength and exhaustion wrapped her body like heavy chains. She could only stare back at the human who had discovered her. James lowered the lantern slightly, letting its glow soften. He studied her, not the way a hunter watches prey, but the way a weary man sees something unexpected. Her skin carried faint marks of a world beyond Earth, a pale shimmer along her cheeks that caught the firelight. Her clothes were torn, rough from travel, and her hands clutched a small piece of bread like it was treasure. Neither spoke. The silence pressed down, thick and heavy. Finally, James set the lantern on the table and took a careful step back. "You don't have to run," he said, his voice even though curiosity edged his tone. "I'm not going to hurt you." Sierra did not believe him. Her eyes narrowed, her body curling tighter against the wall. She had seen humans before, but always from afar. Their soldiers, their loud voices, their cold suspicion. This man was different, but difference did not mean safety. She whispered something in her own language, words that trembled with fear. James could not understand, but he heard the pain in her tone. He lifted his hands slowly, palms open, the universal gesture of peace. "Food," he said gently, pointing toward the table. "Eat." The word struck her like a memory. Food, warmth, life. She wanted to believe him, but trust was a currency she could no longer afford. James could see the battle in her eyes, the war between survival and pride. So he did not press her. Instead, he moved toward the counter, deliberately slow. He cut a piece of bread, poured water into a cup, and placed them where the lantern light glowed brightest. Then he stepped back again, keeping distance, giving her space. Sierra's stomach twisted painfully at the smell. She hated how her body betrayed her, how the hunger clawed at her dignity. For a long moment she remained in the shadows, unmoving. Then, with steps so soft they barely touched the ground, she approached the table. Her eyes never left him, sharp and watchful as though any sudden move from him would send her bolting. Her fingers reached for the bread. She hesitated, then pulled it quickly, almost violently, as though expecting it to be taken away. She broke a small piece and tasted it. Warmth filled her mouth, spreading through her chest, her body trembled. She had not felt this kind of relief in so long that tears threatened to fall. James did not speak. He only watched. The alien woman ate slowly, carefully, still keeping herself half in the shadows. Her large, shimmering eyes glowed faintly in the lantern light, reflecting something James had not seen in years, desperation mixed with dignity. She was not simply a thief. She was someone holding on to the last threads of survival. When her cup of water was empty, she set it back down, her hands shaking. For the first time, she allowed herself to lift her gaze fully toward him. James met her eyes. There was no anger in his face, only quiet wonder. He had lived alone for so long that he almost forgot what it felt like to share his space with another, even if that other was not human. "You don't belong out there in the cold," he said quietly. "Stay for the night, just the night." The words startled her. She shook her head sharply, clutching the bread tighter. Her voice, broken yet strong, finally spoke in rough, halting human tongue. "No trust, no safe, no stay." Her accent was thick, her words jagged, but the meaning was clear. She had lost too much to believe in promises. James did not argue. He only nodded once, understanding. He knew loneliness when he saw it, and he recognized hers. If she left, she might not survive another night, but if she stayed, she would battle the fear that humans and aliens could never truly share trust. The silence returned, but this time it was different. Not the silence of danger, but the silence of two souls standing on the edge of something unknown. Sierra moved back into the shadows, retreating toward the window. Her body was still weak, but her spirit was wary. She could not bring herself to accept his offer, not yet. But she also did not run. Something about his tone, about the calm in his eyes, kept her from fleeing completely. James blew out the lantern, the room falling into darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon remained, spilling silver light across the floor. He settled into his chair, saying nothing more, but his presence filled the silence. And in that fragile quiet, the alien widow sat in the shadows, torn between mistrust and the first spark of hope she had felt in years. The night dragged on, heavy with silence. The only sounds in the old farmhouse were the slow creaks of the wooden beams and the faint rustle of wind against the shutters. James sat at the edge of his chair, his lantern extinguished, but his mind wide awake. Somewhere in the shadows, the alien woman lingered, watching him just as carefully as he watched her. Her name was still unknown to him, but he felt her presence, sharp and restless. She had taken food from his table, water from his cup, and yet he did not feel anger. Instead, he felt an odd mixture of pity and curiosity. What kind of desperation drove her into his home? The minutes stretched until at last, the silence shattered. A faint sound and the clink of a spoon falling to the floor. It echoed too loudly in the still room. James rose instantly, the chair scraping back. His eyes darted toward the noise, and the lantern's weak ember caught her form. She was crouched low near the counter, her body coiled like a trapped animal, her trembling hands gripping the spoon as though it were a weapon. For the first time, James saw her fully. The faint shimmer of her skin, pale and thin, stretched over, a body weakened by hunger. Her eyes glowed faintly, wide with fear. She did not look like a threat, but she looked ready to fight for her survival. "Stop," James said, raising his hand. His voice was firm now, not gentle like before. "No running." The alien woman flinched, pressing her back against the wall. She hissed words in her own tongue, sharp sounds that carried both warning and desperation. He could not understand the language, but the meaning was clear. "Stay away." James did not move closer. He had seen enough frightened animals in his years on the farm to know what fear could do. A cornered creature, no matter how weak, could strike with deadly force. "Don't want to hurt you," he said slowly, spacing his words, hoping she would catch their meaning. He pointed to the food still sitting on the table, then back to her. "Eat, not steal, just eat." Her glowing eyes darted from the bread to him. She did not trust the offer. Her pride refused to accept it, yet her body shook, betraying her hunger. The silence stretched again, but this time the tension was heavier. James could feel it in the air, thick as a rope pulled too tight. If either of them moved wrong, it would snap. Finally, Sierra, though he did not yet know her name, spoke in broken human words. Her voice was hoarse, raw from disuse. "Humans, kill my kind." The word struck him like a blow. James blinked, taken aback. He had heard rumors of battles, skirmishes between settlers and alien wanderers. He had never been part of them, but he knew enough to understand her fear. "I am not them," he answered quietly. "I am only me." Her eyes narrowed, searching, his face for lies. She found none, only exhaustion and a strange patience. Slowly, she lowered the spoon, though her body remained tense. James stepped forward, not fast, not threatening, but steady. Every move was deliberate. He picked up the fallen spoon from the floor and set it on the counter. Then he stepped back again. His actions spoke louder than his words. He was not here to harm her, but the confrontation was not over. Her voice trembled as she spoke again. "Why, help me." It was the question that had haunted her since the moment he first offered food. Humans did not give freely, not to her kind, not after the wars. Every kindness she had once believed in had died, with her husband. Trust was dangerous. Trust could kill. James stared at her, then let out a tired breath. "Because I know hunger," he said simply. "And I know loss." His eyes drifted to the empty chair across the table, the chair that once belonged to his wife. No one should face it alone. Her chest tightened at his words. Something stirred inside her, a memory of compassion she thought she had lost forever. She did not move closer, but she no longer pressed herself against the wall. For the first time since entering his house, she allowed herself to breathe fully. The confrontation had not ended in violence. It had ended in something far more dangerous. The first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. James watched her carefully. He knew this was only the beginning. Trust would not be won in a single night. But he also knew something had changed. She was no longer just a thief in the shadows. She was a soul reaching for survival. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to see a human not as an enemy, but as a chance. The farmhouse was quiet again, but the silence carried a new weight. It was no longer the silence of fear alone. It was the silence of waiting. The alien widow sat by the wall, her trembling hands still clutching the piece of bread she had stolen. Her body was weak, her face gaunt, yet her eyes burned with suspicion. Across from her, James moved carefully, as though every step, every gesture might shatter the fragile truce between them. He went to the stove, stirred the pot of soup, and let the warm smell drift through the air. The rich scent of herbs and vegetables filled the room. Sierra's nostrils flared despite herself, her body responding before her mind allowed it. The hunger inside her was relentless, but pride forced her to sit still, unmoving, as though she would rather starve than accept pity. James noticed her struggle. He set a wooden bowl on the table, ladled the thick soup into it, and placed it where the lantern's glow could guide her. The steam curled upward like soft threads of comfort. Then he stepped back, folding his arms, his eyes steady. "Eat," he said. Just one word, but it carried no command, no demand, only invitation. Sierra shook her head once. "No trick," she whispered in her rough voice, her accent heavy. "Food, then trap." James frowned, but not in anger. Instead, his expression softened with sadness. He sat down, took another bowl, and filled it for himself. Without a word, he lifted the spoon, blew on it gently, and took a slow sip. Then another, then another. The message was clear. The food was no trap. It was just food. Sierra's body betrayed her again. Her stomach growled loudly, the sound echoing in the room. She clenched her fists, embarrassed, but James said nothing. He kept eating, calmly, patiently, like a man waiting for the tide to turn. Minutes passed before she moved. Slowly, she crawled closer to the table, her eyes never leaving him. Her fingers brushed the bowl, hesitant, as though the soup might vanish if she touched it. Finally, she lifted it in both hands and brought it close to her lips. The first taste broke her. Warmth spread across her tongue, down her throat, into her chest. She gasped softly, the sensation almost too much to bear. For so long, food had been cold scraps, bitter roots, tasteless survival. But this was warmth, flavor, life. She took another sip, then another, and soon her hands shook as she devoured it. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, refusing to show weakness. Still, her shoulders trembled with every swallow. James watched quietly, his own spoon resting in his hand. He did not speak, did not ask questions. He simply let her eat, the silence filled only by the sound of soup being finished too quickly. When her bowl was empty, she lowered it slowly as though ashamed of her hunger. She could not bring herself to look at him. "Why?" she asked at last, her voice barely more than a whisper. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes tired but steady. "Because no one should starve," he said. "Not in my house." His words confused her. In her world, kindness had always come with a price, a debt, a chain. But this man spoke as if compassion itself was enough. She searched his face, desperate to find the hidden motive, the reason he would help someone like her. But all she saw was a man who had lost much, just as she had. Sierra gripped the empty bowl tighter. For a fleeting moment, she remembered her husband, how he used to bring food after long days, how they laughed as they shared simple meals. That memory hurt, but it also reminded her she was still alive, still capable of feeling. James finally spoke again, breaking the silence. "What is your name?" She froze. Her lips parted, but no sound came. It had been so long since anyone had asked her name, so long since it had mattered. At last, she whispered, "Sierra." James nodded once, accepting it as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Sierra," he repeated, his voice steady. "I'm James." The two names hung in the air, fragile and uncertain, yet powerful. For the first time, they were no longer strangers. The night grew colder outside, but inside the farmhouse, the warmth of the meal lingered. Sierra sat straighter now, her hands still shaking, but her eyes less empty. She had expected fear, rejection, maybe even violence. Instead, she found soup, bread, and a man who looked at her not as a monster but as a guest. And though she would not admit it aloud, deep inside her chest a fragile spark flickered to life, the kind of spark that could grow into trust. The farmhouse seemed warmer now, though the fire had long since burned low. Sierra sat at the table, her empty bowl in front of her, while James leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest. The tension had not vanished completely. Shadows of fear still lingered between them. But the silence had changed. It was no longer sharp and dangerous. It was waiting, heavy with things unsaid. James studied her quietly. He had fed her, given her space, even learned her name. Yet he still knew nothing about her. She looked fragile, worn thin by hunger. But he could see strength hidden beneath the scars. He wanted to know who she was, why she had risked sneaking into a human's home. What kind of life had driven her here? Sierra's gaze remained fixed on the wooden table. She traced the edges of the bowl with her fingers, slow and restless. Finally, as though the weight of silence became too heavy, she spoke. "My husband," she began, her voice uneven. The words in human tongue came slowly, rough and broken, but clear enough. "He'd gone. War took him." James did not interrupt. He only listened, his expression still. Sierra's eyes darkened as she continued. "We had a home, a small place far from fighting. But soldiers came. Fire came. He fought to keep us safe. He did not return." Her hands trembled slightly, clutching the edge of the table. After, nothing left. No food, no roof. Only me. Her voice cracked at the last words, but she forced herself to stay steady. She would not break in front of this human, She had already shown enough weakness. Tonight, James lowered his eyes. The pain in her story was not foreign to him. He thought of his wife, the quiet mornings they once shared before sickness stole her away. Different worlds, different battles, yet the same grief. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Two simple words, but spoken with weight. Sierra blinked, surprised. She had expected indifference, perhaps even judgment. Instead, he gave her sorrow without conditions. She hesitated, then asked, "You alone too?" James nodded. "Yes. My wife passed years ago. Since then, only me." His voice was calm, but his eyes revealed the loneliness that had hollowed him. "Work keeps me busy, but the nights are long." Sierra tilted her head, studying him carefully. For the first time, she saw not just a human, but a man marked by loss. His pain mirrored her own, different in shape, but equal in weight. The silence that followed was softer than before. James leaned forward slightly. "You've been wandering, haven't you?" Sierra nodded once. "Villages push me away. Some throw stones. Some chase with fire. I take food where I can. I hide when I must." Her jaw tightened. "They call me thief, monster, widow, all the same." James frowned. "Not here," he said firmly. "In this house, you're just Sierra." Her chest tightened at his words. She had not heard her name spoken so simply, without insult or suspicion, in years. For a moment, she almost allowed herself to believe him. The lantern light flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, but inside the farmhouse, the air carried something fragile. A shared understanding, built on the quiet exchange of pain. Sierra spoke again, slower now, as though testing the strength of her voice. "When war came, I thought, no human would ever show mercy. I thought all of you same." She paused, her eyes fixed on him. "But you, different." James shook his head lightly. "Not different, just human. Maybe we forget too often that kindness is a choice." The word struck her deeply. Kindness as a choice, not weakness, not obligation, but choice. She had almost forgotten such things could exist. For the first time, her posture softened. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion heavy on her frame. Yet her eyes no longer carried only suspicion. They carried something else, the first faint trace of trust. James picked up the empty bowls and set them aside, moving quietly, giving her space. He did not press her with questions, though many burned in his mind. Instead, he let her story rest between them like a fragile thread. When he returned to the table, he sat down again and spoke gently. "Sierra, the world has taken much from you. But here, you don't have to run. Not tonight." She lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. Yet her heart, long hardened by grief, felt something it had nearly forgotten. Safety. However temporary, however fragile, it was enough for this night. The two sat in silence once more, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two souls who had shared their wounds, two voices that had spoken loss into the dark and found it echoed in another. And though the night outside remained cold, inside the farmhouse, a small warmth had begun to grow. The warmth of stories shared and the possibility that tomorrow would not be as lonely as yesterday. The morning light crept through the cracks in the wooden shutters, painting thin golden lines across the farmhouse floor. James stirred from his chair, his back stiff from a restless night. Across the table, Sierra sat quietly, her large eyes half closed, exhaustion heavy in her frame. She had not dared to sleep fully, not in the house of a human, but she had not run either. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air. James had risen early to bake, letting the familiar rhythm of work settle his thoughts. Yet his mind was not calm. It circled around the same question: what would happen if others discovered her here? He knew his neighbors well. They were hard people, shaped by years of survival on the edges of human settlement. To them, an alien was not a widow or a wanderer, An alien was a threat. They would not care about her story, her hunger, her grief. They would drive her out, maybe even kill her. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of heavy boots echoed outside. James stiffened. Through the window, he saw two men approaching, his neighbors, carrying rifles slung over their shoulders. Sira noticed the change in his face. Her body tensed instantly, her hand gripping the edge of the chair. Fear sharpened her gaze. She whispered in her broken tongue, "They come for me?" James did not answer. He set down the bread, wiped his hands, and moved to the door. His heart beat fast, not with fear for himself, but for the choice he knew was coming. When he opened the door, the men greeted him with grim nods. "Morning, James," one said. "We saw tracks near your field last night. Not human tracks. Thought we'd check." James forced his expression to stay calm. "Tracks wash out fast around here. Could have been anything." The second man shook his head. "Not anything. There's been talk. An alien widow moving through the valley. Dangerous kind. Thieves, liars, all of them. If you see her, best turn her in before trouble starts." James felt the weight of their words pressing down. He glanced over his shoulder, just for a heartbeat, knowing Sira was hidden in the shadows of the kitchen, her life now balanced on what he would say next. "I haven't seen anyone," James replied evenly. "Just my fields, same as always." The men studied him, suspicion sharp in their eyes. After a long pause, they muttered warnings and turned away, their boots crunching on the dirt road as they headed toward the next farm. James closed the door slowly. His chest tightened, his breath unsteady. He leaned against the wood for a moment, the choice he had just made sinking deep. He had lied for her. He had chosen her. Sira emerged from the shadows, her steps quiet, but her eyes wide with disbelief. "You protect me," she whispered. James turned to face her. "I told them." "Nothing," he said firmly. "But you must understand, Sira. If they find out you're here, it won't be me you'll need to fear. It will be them." Her hands trembled at his words. She had expected betrayal, expected him to save himself at her expense. Yet instead, he had shielded her, confusion mixed with gratitude, emotions she had buried for too long. "Why risk?" she asked, her voice low. James looked at her, his eyes heavy with truth. "Because doing nothing would make me the same as them, and I refuse to be that man." The farmhouse fell quiet again, but this silence was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of a choice made, a path taken. Sira lowered her gaze, her throat tightening. For years, humans had been the source of her pain. They had taken her home, her husband, her hope. Yet here was one man who defied everything she believed, one man who chose kindness over fear. For James, the decision weighed heavily. He knew what protecting her meant. If word spread, he could lose his farm, his safety, perhaps even his life. But as he looked at her, weary, broken, yet still fighting to survive, he knew he could not turn her away. The world outside his walls demanded fear. His neighbors demanded suspicion. But in his heart, something louder spoke: compassion. He walked back to the table, tore a piece of bread, and handed it to her. "As long as you're under this roof," he said, his voice steady, "you are safe." Sira took the bread slowly, her hands trembling. She had no words, only a quiet nod. For the first time, she believed him. And in that belief, something changed. Not just in her, but in him. The farmhouse was no longer only his. It had become a refuge, a sanctuary. Fragile, temporary, but real. James knew the danger had only begun. The world outside would not stay silent forever, but he had made his choice, and he would live by it. The day stretched long, heavy with silence. After the neighbors left, James worked the fields as usual, but his thoughts never strayed far from the farmhouse. Every time the wind shifted, every time the faint sound of boots echoed in the distance, his chest tightened. He had chosen to protect her, but that choice carried weight heavier than his plow. Inside, Sira stayed near the shadows, listening. Every sound outside made her tense, ready to flee. Yet the human had kept his word. He had lied for her, shielded her, fed her. She could not understand why. And yet, for the first time since her husband's death, she felt something other than despair. She felt safety. When James returned that evening, tired and covered in dust, he found her sitting at the table, her eyes fixed on the small loaf of bread he had baked that morning. She looked up at him, and though her expression was still cautious, it no longer carried the sharp edge of suspicion. "You came back," she said quietly, as though she had doubted he would. James set down his tools. "Of course I did. This is my home, and for now it's yours too." Her breath caught at his words. No one had spoken to her like that in years, not as an intruder, not as a burden, but as someone who belonged, even if only for a while. They ate together in the dim light of the lantern. The simple act of sharing a meal carried a weight far greater than either expected. Each bite was not just food, but proof that two souls from different worlds could sit side by side without fear. As the night deepened, Sierra finally spoke, her voice trembling but firm. "You risk much. Why? What do you gain?" James leaned back, his gaze distant. "Not everything in life is about gain," he said slowly. "Sometimes it's about not losing what makes us human." The words struck her deeply. She had seen so much cruelty, so much hatred that she believed kindness no longer existed. Yet here was proof, sitting across from her, wrapped in a tired man's body and a farmer's heart. She lowered her eyes, her chest tightening. "I thought my life ended when he died," she admitted softly. "I thought there was nothing left but hunger and pain. But tonight, I feel something I thought was gone." She paused, struggling to find the human word. "Hope." James's eyes softened. He did not smile, but the heaviness in his shoulders seemed to ease. For a long moment they sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire. The world outside was still harsh, still dangerous. But here, in this small farmhouse, something rare and powerful existed: trust. When Sierra finally lifted her gaze again, her eyes no longer held fear. They held gratitude. "You gave me more than food," she whispered. "You gave me reason to live another day." James nodded slowly. "And you reminded me I'm not as alone as I thought." Their words lingered in the air, fragile, yet unbreakable. Two lives, once shattered, had begun to mend in each other's presence. The wind outside howled, but inside the farmhouse, the warmth of shared humanity burned brighter. Sierra sat taller now, her shoulders less heavy. She was still a widow, still broken by war, but she was no longer empty. She had seen the strength of a human's heart, and it was a gift greater than any weapon or army. James stood and placed another log on the fire. The flames leapt higher, casting golden light across the room. He glanced at her and said simply, "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. But tonight, rest. You're safe." She closed her eyes, letting the truth of his words sink in. For once she allowed herself to believe them. The farmhouse remained small, fragile against the vast, unforgiving world. Yet within its walls a bond had been forged. Not through power, not through force, but through compassion. And as the stars shone above, silent witnesses to their fragile alliance, one truth became clear. In a galaxy filled with war and fear, the greatest strength was not found in weapons or armies. It was found in kindness, it was found in humanity's gift.